If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment for more videos like this.
For people who hike, camp, and explore forests and woods, what's the scariest thing you've ever seen out there?
When I was younger and more ambitious in my early teens, I loved to explore the mountains of my home village and the gates of the Arctic National Park. I knew about how dangerous the caves could be in the mountains and never liked to go near them, but I loved waterfalls, big or small, that fell from great heights in the summer. 1 year ago, I had just received a Honda Foreman 500 as a gift from my mom. I rarely receive physical items as I am not much of a materialistic person, but I do enjoy getting vehicles that I can use for hunting as presents every now and then. Usually they're older models, so they aren't as expensive as the newer models, but I love them just as much, and I take care of them as best as I can. Anyway, I was driving my new Honda through an old trail that I only knew of as a snow machine/snowmobile trail in the winter. I had recently learned about the summer trail, and I decided I would go and explore the valley it led into. While driving, I began to have the eerie feeling of being watched. The hair on my body stood on end on the side. I felt like I was being watched, so I knew where to glance as I drove. I did my best to keep on the old, rocky trail, and I began to glance over to my left as frequently as possible. I think that, as a hunter, I have developed a better sense of when I'm being watched, and it seems to pay off quite a bit in the wilderness up here. As I looked over, I would scan the willow thickets. As I did, I noticed a dark figure keeping up with me. It stood tall, what I presume to be about 8.5 feet tall, and it was keeping up with me as I was going like 25 miles per hour on a fairly smooth but rocky trail. I kicked the Honda into higher gear and sped up. I only stopped feeling like it was just right there after I left the willow thickets. When I was able to, I looked back and watched the willows again. Keep in mind that these are diamond willows that stand about 10 feet tall, and I started to see the figure again. It was nearly as tall as the willows, and it brushed through them with ease, as if it were phasing through them or something. I haven't returned to that trail in quite some time, but I would like to return with my cousins to see if we can get some videos and pictures of whatever it is. I was on a solo backpack trip. I hiked about 18 miles into the Sierra interior and made camp near a lake. I spent 2 nice days fishing. There was not another human in sight. On day 3, I hiked to the southern end of the lake, down by the dam, to do some fishing. The lake was long and narrow at this point, maybe 50 yards across. I heard some noise and noticed 2 guys across the lake. They were in an established horsebacker camp and were furiously piling rocks into a large cairn. I'm talking about a 6-foot-tall pile of rocks. Working fast and furious, grabbing bowling balls and watermelon-sized rocks and piling them up at high speed. And they were both wearing full camouflage gear, with face masks. I'm wearing shorts and a short sleeve shirt because it's around 80 degrees. But these fully clothed, masked guys are in long sleeves and pants and working like crazy men. It was weird. I wanted to get away from it. I started to quietly back away from the lake into the bush, hoping to disappear, but one of them spotted me. I knew they did because he pointed at me, and they both stopped hurling rocks while he pointed. I waved but kept backing into the bush. At that point, they both started running. Not at me, because we had 50 yards of water between us, but rather to their right and towards the end of the lake, so they could circle around and get to me. Though they were only 50 yards away across the water, they'd have to run about a half mile to get to me by circling the lake. I bugged out. Full sprint panic run towards my tent, which was slightly off trail and a couple hundred yards further up the lake. Solo backpack tent and a clean camp, so I was able to strike it down in about 15 seconds. I threw on my backpack, dragging the tent, and raced up a slope away from the lake to a point where I was 100 yards or so above the trail and out of sight. I sat there, quiet and terrified, for 5 minutes, till I heard them coming up the trail. They were muttering stuff I couldn't decipher and clearly searching the area as they went by me. I sat there for an hour, silent, praying they wouldn't circle back and find me. I spent that night there without moving, not lighting a fire, nothing. Just dead quiet. I woke up the next morning and buggered out in the opposite direction I'd last seen them. I forced myself to march with a cotton mouth for 10 miles until I started running into some other packers and joined them. I have never been back to that lake to see what was under that pile of rocks. This happened 2 weeks ago. I was camping in the Wichita Mountains, Oklahoma, with my dad, and we planned on staying for 2 nights. The day we arrived went on without a hitch, but on the first night at our campsite, we experienced something that rocked us to our core. As we were preparing to get into our tents to sleep, my dad saw a strange sense of movement out of the corner of his eye. He looked back, and he told me there's something strange in the sky, and I looked up, and wouldn't you know it, this strange blue light was flying completely straight across the sky and pulsating? It wasn't blinking, It didn't go completely dark each time it pulsed, it just faded and then turned bright again at a few second intervals. We stood staring at it, and then suddenly it shot out these weird beams of blue light in front of it, probably 3 or 4 times, and then it just disappeared in an instant. We talked to other campers, and apparently they saw it too. We have no idea what it was. We didn't sleep well that night. Me and my neighbor M walked to the store and didn't get back to our apartment complex until it was completely dark outside. It was pretty chilly out, as it was early December, around 9:30 to 10 p.m. In order to get to the apartments, we had to walk through a stretch of road with no street lights and covered by trees. Usually, you can use the moonlight that shines through the spaces in the leaves to see. Since it was December, it was cloudy, so there was not a whole lot of moonlight. There's a small entrance to trails that lead up to the cemetery behind the apartments. We smelled something like a decaying animal. We both assumed it was a deer that died, as that's extremely common around the apartments. However, M decided to point the flashlight at the entrance of the trails. We both saw a tall figure crouched down. I'm 5 feet 9 inches, and it would have been eye level to me. It was really skinny, pale gray, with long limbs, and either really sunken in the eyes or none at all. All I saw were 2 black sockets. The way I describe it is that it looked like someone took decaying skin and stretched it across a skeleton. We both ran until we got to M's apartment. We still don't know what we saw that night. We tried to figure it out but never got any answers. It's common for creepy stuff to happen at the apartments, as again, there is a cemetery right behind the buildings, just through the woods. I have some crazy stories from the Navajo Nation. I'm white, but when I lived in SW, Colorado, I had 2 very good Navajo friends raised in Kayenta, Arizona, and dated a gal from Rama, New Mexico. I once drove my buddies to Kayenta to see family and have a meal. Everything was perfectly normal until about an hour before sunset, when their families started rushing us out to make sure we were off the reservation by nightfall. The beliefs about things that lurk in the desert are strong there. It was like a light switch from relaxed conversation to y'all gotta go now. Another time camping with one of those buddies in Arches, Utah, we were up early one morning by the fire and both witnessed what he called a spirit runner. It was a man, or maybe the apparition of a native man, who was running through the desert with no shoes or clothing on. He was running at immense speed, but it also seemed like he wasn't covering the ground as he should. Very bizarre. The girlfriend from Ramah told me a story about her cousin, who got suspicious that his wife was sneaking out at night to see a lover. One such night, he awoke as he heard her leave but didn't move or speak. He just waited a few minutes before he realized she was still in bed next to him. Or at least her body was. Several hours later, he witnessed some ungodly creature crawl back into his wife's body. He told this to someone else, word got back to the wife, and he was dead of a heart attack within a week. Perfectly healthy man. I was in 7th grade, and my friend John told the story. John came over to spend the night. He was bored of playing video games, so we went into a deep forest. We went into a dark cave, and then the night hit, so we started a fire, called our parents, and told them that we're going to spend the night in the cave that we found. John fell asleep first, so I then tried to sleep, but I heard an ear-curdling screech. Just then, John woke up, and I told him what happened. Then we ran out of there and looked back and saw something 8 feet tall with deep, glowing white eyes and no facial features. It was also wearing a black cloak. It was right behind us, running a full sprint. We ran and ran until we found the house. We locked all the doors, and we heard banging. The next day we went back to the cave, and something we saw was something we will never forget. It was blood and a deer carcass there. We never went back. He spent the night 3 weeks later with all doors locked. We were playing video games at home with my brother when we heard a large bang on the door. My brother got the gun, and he saw the creature from the cave. He called the cops. When the cops came, it was gone. This took place on the Olympic Peninsula, along the Hood Canal. My girlfriend's parents recently bought a beautiful riverfront property in a rural area, down a private gravel road that has a few other houses here and there. Their property is heavily forested on all sides, though the neighboring houses are vaguely visible to both the left and right. The night was winding down after watching a movie. Everyone had gone to sleep while I lay awake playing on my phone. The windows were open, letting in the pleasant sound of the river bubbling outside. Close to midnight, I started hearing splashing in the river, which startled my dog but was easily explainable as elk or deer crossing the river since the area is very wild. However, after the splashing subsided, I started hearing a repeated animal cry that sounded like a sort of bellow mixed with a scream or yell. It's hard to remember exactly at this point in time, but it was deep, not like a cougar or fox screaming, and fast in cadence. Definitely odd, but still explainable as an animal. This happened for 10 minutes or so. intermittently with what sounded like a huffing or snorting sound. I was alert at this point, listening and trying to calm my dog, who was unsettled by the sound as well. As I listened, it started moving closer, at first sounding like it was across the river but now on the right side of the house. As it moved closer, it transformed into what sounded like a human screaming help. In the most deranged, unsettling way possible. It was screaming help, but I couldn't quite form or enunciate the words correctly. It literally gives me goosebumps thinking about it right now. At this point, I was thinking, what the duck? And woke up my girlfriend. We listened together in silence and rushed to wake up her parents when we both heard a pronounced help in the scream. Both dogs started going ballistic, and the screaming stopped at some point in the commotion, so her parents didn't get a good grasp on the sound. After shining flashlights out the windows, we went downstairs and made sure all the doors and windows were locked. After a sleepless night, we woke up and walked the perimeter of the property and found no sign of animals or humans. I was half expecting to see bloody human remains or something, given how intense the screams were. I imagine that's what a person being axe-murdered would sound like. At this point, I really regret not going outside, armed, to investigate, as I've spent the past 2 days constantly racking my brain trying to figure out exactly what that was. I've looked into every animal sound out there and haven't found a single thing that actually sounds similar to what we heard that night. I'd probably think I imagined the whole thing if my girlfriend hadn't heard it as well. I'd love to hear any thoughts and/or similar experiences from this community. I grew up near the reservation. I also have 2 family members who are Navajo. There are some creepy things out there, for sure. I've felt things, and I've heard a lot of stories from my brothers. One thing that happened to me as a teenager was extremely creepy. We were driving through the res to get to Colorado for a concert. Out in the middle of nowhere, we saw an old woman walking on the side of the road. She was traditional Navajo, Diné, with a velvet skirt and her hair tied with cotton string. I remember thinking it was a little weird that she was in the middle of nowhere, no houses were around, and she was elderly. She looked at us as we drove past. About 20 miles later, we saw her again. She looked at us, and it was the same lady. It creeped us all out. It's possible she had an identical twin or something, but I'm good with faces, and it was the same woman. We hadn't stopped. I was going for a random stroll on a trail not far from town and saw a man hugging a tree. I thought it was weird, so I sped up and circled around the trail. I had to go back the way I came to get to the parking lot, but it had been an hour, so I figured the weird tree guy would be gone. Nope, he was still there, hugging the same tree, but his pants were down and he was moaning. I booked it out of there as fast as I possibly could. As I got closer to the parking lot, I saw a lady walking towards me with her dog, and I had to tell her about the creepy tree guy. I couldn't just leave her to stumble upon that with no warning. She decided to leave and find a different place to walk, so we both got in our cars and left. The weirdest SHT I've seen out in the woods, for sure. Definitely a creepy and probably the craziest forest/wood story I have. I remember back in high school when 2 friends and I went down a path that led into the woods in our neighborhood to smoke some weed. We started loading up a pipe when one of my friends caught my attention by saying, "What the duck is that?" I looked up at him with some confusion and saw he was pointing down the path. I looked down the path, and about 20 yards or so, there was this lanky figure that was standing somewhat hunched over beside a tree, with big yellow or greenish eyes. Keep in mind we weren't super far into the woods, and there was a street light behind us that kept it somewhat light in that area and bright enough to see a decent amount into the woods, but not very clearly. We were quite frightened, and I remember that feeling of my heart dropping and getting chills, and I said to my friends, "I think we should go, I'm not getting a good feeling about this." As we turned to pack up our stuff and head out, I turned back and noticed that the figure was gone from beside the tree. At that moment, we started walking briskly back to the street, and then that turned into a jog or run, as we didn't have far to go to get out of the woods and back onto the street. Once we were about 10 to 15 yards from the beginning of the path, my wallet fell out of my back pocket. Startled and thinking I couldn't possibly leave my wallet behind, I turned back to get it, and my friends continued down the street. I located my wallet in the middle of the path, and beside me, there was a puddle of water that was visible from the path and was surrounded by some shrubbery and trees. I heard a noise come from that area, and I turned my head abruptly after I had just picked up my wallet. I shit you not, I watched this lanky-ass body and legs of what seemed to be a very realistic version of Golem crawl across the puddle onto dry ground and behind some bushes. The puddle had also rippled behind it, making it all the more real. I remember at that moment my heart dropped once again, and I acted on pure adrenaline and ran faster than I had ever run to the end of the path, back onto the street. Nothing more came from this, but dear God, I am still weary to this day, and I remember I didn't sleep a second that night when we got back. My 2 friends and I ended up naming this thing the Shambler. I was 16. Camping with just the family dog on some property my family owned in northern Michigan. The family dog was a Chow Black Lab mix, built like a tank but also ridiculously mild-mannered. The second night we're up there, I wake up in the middle of the night to the dog standing in the middle of the tent, teeth bared, hackles up, and this damn near subsonic growl coming out of him. He's doing a slow turn, obviously tracking something that is moving around the tent. I can hear footsteps and a kind of snort or breathing noise from the outside. My dog does a full revolution and is facing back toward the entrance flap, and I'm just laying there trying to find my flashlight and barely breathing. After what felt like an eternity, but couldn't have been more than a few minutes, he starts to relax and eventually calms down enough to sit next to me, but he won't take his attention off the flap. We both stayed awake staring at the entrance until the sun was up, and then I did the fastest campsite pack-up of my life and headed back to civilization. I was 13 at my grandfather's hunting camp. My uncle had just bought a new hunting camera and wanted to test it out, so he set it up out in the woods. I got the brilliant idea to go up in the woods with my 2 other cousins and moon it, so when he checked the card, instead of wildlife, he would have seen some cheeks. Hilarious to a 13-year-old's mind, and after some convincing, my other 2 cousins were in, but we had to go under the cover of darkness. So we set our alarms for 3 a.m. and passed out. By 3:15, we all sneak outside, throw on our headlamps, and start walking. We know the camera is about a mile away. The trail goes over 2 pretty big hills, and the camera is in a valley on the far side of the second hill. We start walking as normal, and everything is good. The excitement starts building, and we're pretty giddy that we are pulling this glorious prank. After a few minutes of brisk walking, we get to the top of the second hill. My older cousin, who knows the area better than me, stops as he gets to the top. As I make my way to the top, I see why. Off in the distance, about 400 yards, is a spotlight. Its bluish-white color illuminates nearly half of the hill it's pointed at. This thing was crazy bright. By this time, all 3 of us were looking at the light, and my older cousin told us to turn off our headlamps. We stand there in silence. Me, being the 13-year-old pussycat I was, started to get freaked out. Aliens are the first thing that comes to mind, and I tell him we have to leave. I turn on my headlamp and turn around, about to head back to the campsite. As soon as I turn my light back on, the super bright blue light starts to slowly turn and stops right on us. No bobbing or movement from the light, besides, just a slow motion does not pan right over to us. At this point, I nope the duck out, with my cousins right behind. I get inside and go straight to bed, pretty much freaking out. Flash forward to next morning, all 3 of us go back to the same spot and then proceed to go to where we thought the light would have been, and there was nothing there. No boot marks, no light, no nothing. To this day, I still have no idea. My boyfriend and I were staying in a tiny home in Navajo Nation right across from Monument Valley in 2019 that was solar powered. It was one of the last stops on a road trip through Colorado and Utah. There was only a shared outhouse with a bathroom that you had to access by going outside. The area is vast, beautiful, and feels somewhat desolate because of the lack of fertile earth. To set the scene, the tiny home is on a cliffside with a spreading view of all of Monument Valley. Behind it are large red rock formations with hiking trails. There are a few homes around, but they are very spread apart. It has a strong energy about it, and there were petroglyphs on some of the rock formations around the tiny home. We arrived in the early afternoon and settled in. As night was falling, my boyfriend called his dad to tell him we had arrived safely and to tell him where we were. His dad has had some experience in Navajo Nation as he's come to the area before to do a sweat tent ceremony, and he told us he always felt off there. He then told us to watch out for skinwalkers, and we had both not heard of them before, so we giggled to ourselves about him being fearful over something unreal. We got off the phone, and my boyfriend started Googling. After a few minutes, he looked over at me and said, "Well, the worst thing that happens is we die," and at that moment, all of the power in the cabin went out. Completely. It was totally dark, and this tiny home had huge glass windows bordering the whole interior. We were scared to death, and of course, the only way to use the restroom was to go outside. We both slept poorly that night. Thankfully, nothing happened from there. However, the next morning, I woke up to a pack of feral horses standing right outside our window, and one was staring into my soul. I went outside to take photos, and I felt like it was trying to lead me back into the large red rocks. It truly felt like the energy of the area was reminding us it was there. Especially when we scoffed at it. Overall, it was a really cool experience, albeit a bit humbling and scary. My family used to have our reunion with all the relatives you know, people you don't see very much, and it lasted about a week, but you could leave any time. This was the last time we had it at a random church here in Utah, but back to the story. I can't remember where we were, it's been years, but I remember it was Idaho. We'd rent out a couple camp spots all around the area to keep everyone close, and during the days we'd rent out with family. Well, on one of the last days, almost everyone was gone, so we had one camp set up. I remember walking out of the ring of campers and tents into the woods to go take a leak, and halfway through, I heard a noise by my feet. I looked down, and there's an impossibly yellow snake, like a fluorescent yellow with black diamonds. I heard it hissing, and I freaked out until I heard a bigger noise up in the trees, about 20 feet. If that, I looked up, and I froze. I saw a pale yellow and cloudy eye behind a tree with raggedy-looking arms and legs poking out with clumps of fur sticking to its sickly skin. It took everything I had to slowly make myself back up, and without looking away, it started to move towards me. Using the trees as cover or trying to reach their size and wanting to see me made it impossible to hide. It felt like it was staring at me and trying to stop me from moving. It was working, my slow steps became non-existent. It kept creeping closer, but then it stopped as it looked up. I heard my dad asking me why it was taking so long until dinner was ready. He didn't finish what he was saying before grabbing me and running back to camp. Before my dad could explain to everyone why he was running with me under his arm, we heard a scream so loud and wrong that it made the air shake and was quickly followed by trees breaking and the sound of something running away. We left the camp, leaving anything not in the car already. My dad drove us all home and stayed with us through the night, but when the sun rose, he went to go pick up our stuff. When he came back, the food we left was rotting with maggots wriggling inside and smelled awful. I remember thinking about how it went bad so fast. It was so bad and fresh last night, but now it looks like it's weeks old. My dad was silent about it until years later, when I had grown up. He asked if I remembered the last time we had the reunion, and he filled me in on some things, like when he got back to camp to grab our gear, the tents were ripped open, the trailer doors were ripped off the hinges, and the roofs were shredded up. All the food in coolers or fridges was rotten once again. He warned me never to go back or get close, especially during the night, because it saw me, it saw through me, and if I go back, it will find me. A few years ago, at the end of high school, me and a few friends decided to go camping in a random neck of the woods, well behind one of their houses, a good way up this mountain, and far enough from the other homes so that they wouldn't go nuts and call the cops or anything after they saw us carrying tools into the woods. So we all found a spot to stay and set up, though the floor of the forest was angled up because it was on a mountain. Me and one guy stayed for now to chop up some firewood, while the others went back down to grab food and drinks and the tents and chairs. There's two weird things that happened here, one really weird and one extremely weird. Here's the first. While the two of us were there chopping up wood, a huge adult deer approached us. We had no food at this point and assumed it was just foraging, but it wasn't. It got uncomfortably close to us, about 5 or 6 feet away, even despite the noise of chopping. It sat down low on the ground and stared straight at us. It didn't lower its head to target us with its antlers, and it seemed oddly calm. Its eyes were also clear, which is a good sign it didn't have something like rabies causing it to act irrationally. Eventually it left, and the others returned with the rest of the stuff about 10 or 15 minutes later. Now, we set up our stuff. All the tents were fairly close together, though mine was furthest up the mountain. We sat by the fire, ate stuff, and also drank. So admittedly, I did have some vodka here, so the rest of the story could just be booze talking. Eventually, we put out the flames and went to our tents. It was pretty cold, so I had trouble sleeping despite being in a sleeping bag, and then the second thing happened. I heard this weird sound. My head was at the end of my tent, pointed up the mountain. I heard something else that was extremely strange. You probably know what it sounds like when something heavy impacts a dirt floor. It's like a dull thumping noise. But these noises started out quiet and far away and descended the mountain extremely quickly. It sounded like a bipedal stride, with a noticeably wide distance between impacts. I remember looking through the semi-transparent tent material upside down and seeing the silhouettes of the trees growing down into the sky. And there was something tall gliding across the tops of the trees, now making no noise, periodically blocking out the sky between treetops. Eventually there was the sound again, and the bipedal thumps began again, each one noticeably distant from the last. It went sideways across the forest, away from us, before ascending. I didn't mention this to anyone else, and they didn't say anything about it either. But that's why I don't go randomly camping in the middle of nowhere. I think the best explanation is probably a bear that freaked out and climbed a tree when it saw our camp, since they can do that quickly, but still. I was on a trip with my great aunt, let's call her Eva, and many other family members. We would have family cookouts at the family camp every summer, and they always brought me the best of memories. That summer was difficult for many reasons, so that trip to camp was exactly what I needed. We had burgers, hot dogs, and watermelon, the ingredients for a perfect cookout. That day was wonderful for me, but the night was when I realized that the old tales my great-grandmother told me were true. When the night came, we had many choices of where to sleep, either one of the two campers, Eva's car, or the camp house. I chose one of the campers that night. Most of my family chose the camp house, and a couple of my cousins chose the camper behind the one I was sleeping in. I think I slept for at least an hour before I heard scratching at the camper. At first, I thought it was one of my cousins. So I yelled for them to stop, saying that I was trying to sleep. It didn't stop, and I started getting very pissed off, so like the stupid teen I was, I stormed to the door and opened it. All I saw was a blur of brown fur run into the woods near the camper I was in. I screamed and fell back, hitting my head in the process. I got up and slammed the door closed as I heard my two cousins, we'll call them John and Carl, yell bear. Even though I saw the creature have the tail of a wolf and the face of a cat. I remembered a tale my great-grandmother told me. It was a tale about an alchemist who created a homunculus to take revenge on a town that tried to kill her for praying to God. The town called it fake. The creature in the story was a combination of a brown bear, a coyote, and a mountain lion. After recalling this, I was even more afraid. I know the two creatures are the same. But sadly, my family didn't believe me, they were certain that it was a bear. If you all believe me, please let me know, there's something in those woods. And I don't think it's friendly. I grew up in a small town in northern Michigan. This story happened when I was 12. I was playing outside with my friends, who we'll call Tom and Seth, when Seth suggested we play in the forest. The forest was big and had an unnerving feeling. We entered the forest, and I immediately felt like I was being watched, but I didn't tell my friends because I knew they would make fun of me. After some time of playing with sticks and building forts, Tom said that he saw something. Yeah, right, Seth said. I nervously suggested, maybe we should leave, it's getting dark. My friends looked at me and started to laugh. They had pranked me, but in that instance, all of us heard a low hiss like a screech in the distance. Dude, what the hell was that? Seth said that friend almost never cussed unless he was extremely scared or surprised. We all looked at each other with a confused look. The sound continued to echo through the forest. Let's go back. Tom. We started to head back when we heard the sound again. We froze, and the sound was very close. I turned, and my blood ran cold. The creature was tall, thin, and had gray skin. This monster also had what looked like a skull on its head. It turned slowly to look at us, and when it looked at us, it stared at us. We started running away from it. We heard its heavy footsteps coming toward us. We reached my house and locked the door. We waited for my parents to come home, and when they got home, we explained what happened. My parents passed it off as my imagination. I still remember its hollow, dark eyes. I still don't know what it was. I think it was a Wendigo or a skinwalker. Me and my friends never forgot what happened in that forest. This is my friend's story, so I'll try to explain it as well as I can. Telling it from her point of view, me and my boyfriend at the time decided to go camping with his parents. They were in a camper while me and my boyfriend were staying in his Jeep. We were camping on his family property, so there was no one from the public there at all. We had been fighting, and I decided to hop out of the Jeep to blow off some steam. I had a lantern with me and went into the woods. I heard the car door open and close, so me being me, I shut my lantern off so he couldn't find me. I heard the car door shut and close again. Instead of coming to find me, he decided to get back into the car because he said he had a sick feeling in his stomach and decided it would be a bad idea to leave the car. Great boyfriend, I know. Anyway, as I am sitting in the dark woods, very upset, I see a black figure. Figuring it's my boyfriend, I yell at him, get up without turning my lantern on, and storm off past the figure. I get back to the car, and as I open the door, my boyfriend is sitting there. I ask if he was out there, and he explains to me that he stayed in the car because he felt weird leaving. The figure wasn't the work of his mother or father. Whoever that was, I'm glad I never met you or saw your face. I'm a teenage girl from a small military community in Canada. Nothing bad ever happens here, which makes what I am about to tell you all the more creepy. This happened to me, my best friend, and my best friend's brother about 5 years ago. I had just turned 12, and I was staying the night at my best friend Nate's house. About a block away from his house, there was a small bit of forest. So Nate's older brother Logan suggested that we all go exploring there. Being the adventurer kids, We were Nate, and I happily agreed. So later that day, we all walked up there. The place is called Hermit's Hill. We got there and explored for a bit, but the whole time I had this odd sensation, the one you get when you are being watched. Now I have always been a cautious person. Nate and Logan knew this, so when I told them how I felt, they just dismissed it as me being paranoid. We had been there for almost an hour, and at this point, the three of us are just sitting on the bank of the creek that runs through the forest. The boys were just talking, but I was freaking out because that feeling from earlier was now amplified up to 11, and I had no clue why. Then Logan began to whistle, which was nothing out of the ordinary, but from somewhere in the forest, we heard someone whistle back the exact same thing as Logan just did. All of us froze and looked in the direction it came from, and as Logan went to whistle again, it happened. From the right of Nate and I came a low force from the bushes. He said, "Hey little boy and girl, come play with me in the forest." With that, we all took off, running towards the forest exit. I have never run so fast in my life. We could hear him yelling all your typical creepy stand your lines as we ran. At one point, I thought I could footstep behind us, and all I could think was that I was going to get killed. I quickly glanced behind us, but when I looked back, I ran into a branch and got it right in the eye. I was in so much pain that I had temporarily forgotten what was happening. The next thing I knew, I was being dragged out of the forest by Nate and Logan. At which point I passed out due to the combination of pain and fear. When I woke up, I saw Nate over me, asking if I was okay. I sat up and looked around with a good eye. We had made it out of the forest at the end, where the creek started. After that, we went back to Nate's, and his mom took care of my eye. Nate and I are now 16, and Logan is almost 18. We still talk about what happened that day in the forest, and we speculate on what or who that was. But we have never gone back to Hermit's Hill since that day, and I will never forget how scared I was. Back when I was 14 years old, my mother took me and my brother on a week-long trip to a mountain range in the southeast of Spain, close to the old town of Riperviejo. We had already spent half of the week going on multiple hikes, and we visited beautiful lakes where me and my brother would swim despite them being super cold. Overall, we had already had a lot of fun, and we were enjoying our small family trip so far. One day, while it was very sunny and warm, we went on a hike again to this kind of abandoned trail, which some of the locals of the village had recommended. It was not accessible by car, and there was no phone service. We could not care less, since we love to spend time in nature, and we would just spend our time walking and talking instead of being on our phones. We found a crystal clear lake with beautiful turquoise greenish water and lots of water vegetation in it. My brother and I immediately jumped in, and afterwards we had picnics for lunch. So far, so good. Suddenly, while we were enjoying our bocadillo de jamón, we heard a loud scream. It was very high-pitched and just overall scary. Considering the fact that we were next to the lake in a small valley between tall mountains, we could hear its kind of echo. All three of us immediately looked at each other, startled. We were certainly not imagining anything. From what we could deduce, the sound came from the other side of the lake, in a very bushy area. The lake itself was not very big, and we decided to make our way around it to investigate. Because, although we had not seen anyone during the entire day out there, maybe someone was in danger or needed help. I cannot really specify what the scream sounded like. In hindsight, it was not your typical scream for help, but who knows what humans are capable of sounding like when in dire need of help, right? After a 20-minute walk, we were already getting to the entrance of the bushy area on the other side of the lake, all three of us approaching with our walking sticks in hand and in a cautious position. The first thing we noticed was an awful smell of rotting flesh. That, together with the scream earlier, made us feel a sense of dread. Normally, you would feel welcome when helping someone out, but we did not feel welcome at all in this place. My instincts were telling me we should just backtrack our way out of there while not losing sight of the bushy area. However, we could not shake the feeling that we had to help if someone needed it. So we decided to proceed slowly. The joy and laughter we had on the other side of the lake were no more. Whatever was going on this side of the lake felt wrong and ominous. I cannot talk on my brother's or mother's behalf, but the hair on my arm stood on end. After making our way through the bush for 10 minutes, we finally reached a clearing. During this whole time, the sense of dread continued, and the awful smell of rotting flesh only increased. Finally, in the middle of the clearing, we saw what had caused this smell. In what seemed to be the perfect middle of this small clearing, we found the dead corpse of a deer. Or at least, what remained from it. The limbs were removed from its torso, and the head was half eaten. The thing is, the cadaver looked fairly fresh, as if it had been killed that same day. However, the smell was still that of a rotting and decayed corpse. It did not make any sense. We checked for footprints or dung in the clearing but did not find anything. A logical explanation would be wolves, or even bear since we got both of them in rural Spain. However, the missing footprints and the way this deer was ripped apart made it seem almost unnatural. After we had checked the surroundings, we left as quickly as possible. On our way back, we did not stop to rest at the lake or anything. We just wanted to get out of there as quickly as possible. When we were leaving the valley behind us, halfway up one of the surrounding mountains, we heard another scream, similar to the first one. However, this time we did not feel the urgency to check if someone needed help. Instead, we paced up our speed and did not go back. Somewhere in the evening, when we finally made it back to our village, we went for dinner at a small old bar in the picturesque town square. We talked to some of the elder people from the village about our experience with their abandoned trail. They told us that apparently we had somewhere taken a wrong turn on the trail since it was not very clear, and that this was the reason we ended up at the valley with the lake. They also told us that a few centuries ago, during the Spanish Inquisition, the local townspeople had gone to that valley because a so-called witch lived there and set her house on fire, killing the poor woman. Since then, the locals have never hiked close to the lake or its surroundings in the valley. A couple days later, we left to go back home, but we have never been able to shake the feeling of dread we experienced that day. Again, we are not superstitious or big believers in the supernatural, but what happened on that day was definitely weird. I took my 2 dogs for walks. I normally walk Finn toward the park where I have had these experiences, and I walk Booger in the other direction toward downtown. On my walk with Finn, about a block away in the direction I was headed, I saw 3 or 4 deer calmly walking toward the park. Most nights where something weird happens to me start like this. The deer seemed completely unbothered by me as I approached. They kept walking toward the park but stopped every few steps to look back at me, as if they wanted me to follow them. Then, as Finn and I reached where the deer were, I noticed about 10 or more other deer waiting as well. They all start walking together, calm, but still looking back at me every few feet. On my way toward the park, I smell the stench of rotting meat. I know the smell very well, as I used to be a butcher. It was strong. Like someone plugged my nostrils with rotting ground meat or something. At the same time I smell this stench, I get chills. Finn's hair stands up, and he gets more nervous. I can feel the air around me get colder. As we continue walking, I look down an alleyway that cuts the block in half, and if you would walk down the dark alley, I would spot you out, where I eventually walked back home. I was 2 blocks away from the park. When you reach the park, you can either turn around and walk down the same road, continue into the park, or continue on the road that turns left. Looking down that alleyway, you are looking at the part of the road that continues left, which is the way I take every night on my way back home. What I saw I tried to convince myself wasn't real, or maybe I just saw something else and my brain tried to convince me it was this. A large, muscular, pale, hairless creature was moving fast. So fast I could barely see it. I saw the motion down the alley, about 2 blocks away. The exit of the alley on that side has a street light directly above it. It wasn't standing still, it was moving, and it was moving fast. The only reason I'm positive what I saw wasn't deer or something normal is because of something I saw later that night that I will write about when I talk about my walk with Booger. It solidified that what I saw was something I wasn't supposed to see. In the meantime, I convinced myself I was making stuff up and being a pussycat. As we approached the tree line of the park, a large group of deer moved to the side of the street where the neighborhood is, while I'm on the side with the tree line. I noticed something in the clearing. A lone deer, separate from the large group across the street, stared directly at me. I have my flashlight pointed at him, and I even hung up my call with my wife to use my phone to take video of this moment. This lone deer doesn't even have micro-movements from breathing. The other deer across the street were constantly readjusting. You might be thinking to yourself, oh yeah, deer do that with bright lights shining at them. Deer in headlights always act like that. Just wait. Finn starts to pull very hard and acts anxious, nearly knocking me over. I turn to look across the street towards the large group of deer for at most 3 seconds before quickly turning around to face the lone deer again. In those 3 seconds, that lone deer is easily 30 feet closer to me, still not moving, staring directly at me. I have this on video, I have pictures. I felt weird, I felt unsafe. I've lived in rural Iowa my whole life, and I have always lived outdoors. This didn't feel normal. I was scared. I back away while shining my light at the deer. Once I get a block or so away, he finally turns around and calmly walks into the tree line. The whole way home, I feel like I'm being stalked, not just watched, but like something is following me. Now, I went home and sat for a bit and tried to talk myself into believing it was all a coincidence. After nearly 20 minutes, I started to walk Booger, my smaller chi mix. The entire walk was nice and very enjoyable, Actually, I had my earbuds in and was talking to my wife about what I saw in a joking way. "Man, I'm such a pussycat, I really scared myself for no reason," I said. At the end of the walk, I turned to go down our alleyway as I leave from the garage on our walks. I stopped speaking from what I saw on the opposite end of the alley. My wife heard me stop. I want to preface this with I did not have any substances, including alcohol, for weeks up to that point. The most I ever do in that department is have a few beers, or I'll use some weed to ease anxiety if life is getting hard. I have no mental conditions that will cause me to hallucinate. The most I have is a personality disorder resulting from trauma that I've been overcoming quickly this past year. I saw two large, muscular, pale, hairless creatures walking like apes at the end of the alley. The same thing I thought I saw with Finn, this time not going fast, much closer, and it felt intentional. I saw them walk across the street very slowly, staring directly at me. These were not deer. They didn't have long faces like deer, they didn't have fur or tails, and they didn't walk like deer. They weren't slender like deer. My first thought was, honestly, that I was looking at two hairless male lions. In the middle of Iowa. I stood there, paralyzed with fear, well after they had left my sight. 15 seconds later, I finally get the courage to walk a few feet into the garage. When I take my first step, I see a third one. Slowly meandering across the street. Staring at me. Booger noticed him too, and he started growling. I ran to the door and watched the garage shut all the way. The entire night, Finn guarded the bedroom door. He never does that. He sat staring at the door all night. Booger stared at the windows all night. He never does that either. I don't know what to think. I'm an average woman, around 5 feet 6 inches, and pretty fit. I am studying to be an anthropologist and have been a member of search and rescue for quite some years in my teens. I am now 26. I am an avid hiker and backpacker, and I was raised on a farm raising sheep, horses, and cattle. In a nutshell, I'm not squeamish, have a good head on my shoulders, know how to take care of myself, and most importantly, I don't have any family history of crazy people, nor have craziness in myself. So, a couple of years ago, before I got married and moved states, I went hiking alone with my dog in Jeff Park, Oregon. Mount Jefferson is a huge mountain, and I have done many search and rescue cases out there, so I was confident and prepared for the night ahead. It was early summer, rather cool out, and no rain was in the forecast. All I needed was my 24 pack, which had plenty of food, survival gear, and overnight things. Now, here's the terrifying part that I still, today, cannot comprehend or explain. When I sleep anywhere outside of the comfort of my bed, I generally don't sleep at all. My nights are filled with waking up every hour and spending long moments just thinking or staring. I had a light-up watch that I checked often to keep track of the hours, and I remember the time being a little after 1:15 a.m. I wasn't quite awake or asleep either, somewhere in between enough to startle at the growling of my dog. He was a large lab mutt who didn't take very kindly to strangers and had proven to be very protective. When it came to animals, he didn't care much, aside from the regular woofing or showing deep interest in deer. So, growling meant a person was nearby. Remembering I was in an area that was popular for camping, I told him to quiet down but grabbed my knife just in case and listened intently. Never in my life have I ever seen this dog not listen to a command. I mentioned before that he was protective. Once a man tried to steal my bag when we were walking in the park. Don leapt out at him, grabbing onto his arm, but released right when I told him to. But at this moment, he was going a little berserk, growling and nearly whining. Suddenly, I mean very suddenly, he froze and went rigid against my leg. Scared at this moment, I grabbed my flashlight and sat up, ready to either blind someone breaking into the tent or stab randomly, hoping I hit them. What happened next was even worse. There was this calling noise, like a mix between a grunt and a moan. I can't explain it very well, but it definitely wasn't a bear, cougar, or elk. It sounded nearly human, like someone trying to sound animalistic but reaching a note that wasn't normal. Don jumped when another called out to the other side of us, his body trembling. I've never felt a dog so scared in my entire life. When he started to whine, I realized that we were in very deep trouble. Looking back now, I'm guessing this was a dumb idea, but at the moment, leaving the tent was the greatest idea ever. Making the loudest noise in the world, I unzipped the tent, and we scrambled towards some bushes that seemed to be away from the weird calls. Again, checking my watch over and over, we were sitting there for about 20 minutes before the calls started up again. They began small, almost like chirping, or when a dog woofs in their sleep as they're twitching. I don't know, it's hard to explain. Don, fully rigid and protective now, started growling in random directions, I'm guessing wherever these things were. We could hear bodies moving around the foliage, scraping against trees, crunching over the needles, etc. Shit hit the fan when Don decided to attack whatever they were, leaving me huddled in the bush with a flashlight and a knife. I turned the light on, abandoning all camouflage, and screamed for him to come back. Fear is a dumb thing that makes you rather stupid. I left the bushes and crouched in his direction until I ate it down a slope in some tree roots or something. I slammed my weight into my flashlight and lost the light for a moment as it was face down in the dirt. But when I raised it back up again, I got a glimpse of something almost translucent jogging past me. I cannot name any features, but I saw long legs and arms. I would definitely say it was a naked human being, but the skin wasn't normal flesh. It was purplish with a green sheen in the light. Again, I only saw it flash by me before I instinctively began screaming and running back to the bushes. Meanwhile, Don was wrestling something and making a hell of a racket a ways away. I was too terrified to go help him. I felt so useless. The calls were sounding out too, more like screams and groans. They turned into weird clicks, or caw-caw-caws, and then short hissing spurts. I heard Don bark a bunch and then a crashing noise, and I spotted him cowering back to me. Miraculously, he only had a few scrapes on his snout and back legs that looked more like trees than an attack. Being about an hour away from my car, we just huddled under the bushes until about 3 a.m. and dared to go back into the tent. I think I was so scared that I began crying at some point and ended up curling around Don with my knife at the ready. Before dawn even happened, I packed everything up, and we ran down the mountain to the car. I called my mom and told her we were coming back early and that I'd explain everything later. On our drive down, I stopped at the ranger station, but the doors were locked and nobody was there. Not willing to hang around, I headed home and told my mom and sisters what had happened. Later on, I talked to the rangers, trying not to sound absolutely insane, and they said they'd look into it. A few days later, they reported that they didn't find anything but what looked like a scuffle where my dog attacked the thing. There was dried blood, but I never thought to ask them to analyze it or dig a little deeper. They believed it was from a coon, a coyote, or even something larger. At first, they were more concerned that it was a group of people playing a prank, and my dog tore through one of them, but there were no boot prints, pieces of clothing, or anything left behind. Now, I know this sounds absolutely insane. There are times that I even question my memory, but I was smart enough to write everything down the day after it happened. I've had to get some therapy just to put this all aside, and I've since gotten back into hiking and camping in Southern California with my husband and our new dog, as Don has since passed. My mind clearly says alien, but everything about that gives me the creeps, and I try not to think about it. Anyway, that's my story. I'm a little ashamed to know that when shit hits the fan, I cry a little and run for cover. This happened about 2 years ago. Me, my fiancé, and my best friend decided to go to this popular hiking trail near us. The trail leads to a giant rock that hangs off a cliff. It's a beautiful view over the city I live in. It's a long walk through the woods, you're on the same trail, going straight for most of the hike. The trail eventually makes a sharp turn, gets thinner, and gets very steep. You really have to hike up this part, and then you reach an open field where you can see the rock above you. You have to climb up one more path that leads you to the rock. Even though the hike is long, the path is very easy, and it's hard to mess up, considering this is the only path in that area of the woods that I've found. I've done it multiple times at this point. Even hiked down well after midnight, after watching fireworks on the 4th of July. Anyway, the three of us decided that since we were walking close to the road that leads you to the trail, we were going to go visit. It was about 7 p.m., so it started to get dark pretty fast. We didn't even make it off the first part of the trail I already mentioned. It goes straight for about an hour until you get to the sharp turn. We didn't even make it to that. We decided that, since it was getting dark, we should turn around. We all had our flashlights on, and everything was normal. We never set foot off the path. The path is pretty much dark, engulfed by trees, but there is this one spot where the trees open up. You can see the entire downtown area of my city, and it feels very high up because this trail is basically in the middle of the hillside surrounding the whole town. If you have ever been to Pennsylvania, you get it. We got to the spot where the clearing is where you can see downtown. But it looked flip-flopped. I don't even really know how to explain it. It looked like the town was flipped, like how you can flip an image on your phone. Someone took the town and flipped it the other way, if you get it. It was late and dark, and we were tired of walking, so I just don't think we really took it seriously when we walked past. I still felt the weird feeling, though, and I felt like everything was going backwards all of a sudden. That's the only way I can really describe it, backwards. And we all said the same thing to each other. It was my fiancé who said something first, which is just weird because usually he'd be the last to say anything in a situation like that. All he said was that he feels backwards. My best friend freaked out because she gets anxiety like that and said she felt the same way. I mentioned the clearing looked weird, and they all agreed with me. They thought the same thing but thought they were being silly. At this point, we should be close to the exit, but it felt like we were going in circles. The path started breaking, like the path wasn't even the same we'd been walking on, so we turned back around towards the rock to try to figure out where we were. We came back to the clearing, and it still looked weird, so we took pictures. I do have them still if anyone cares to see them, but you wouldn't be able to make out that it looks flip-flopped unless you live in the same town. We knew we were at the clearing though because it's the only part where the wood's clear, and we knew that we were on the right path as we've never even gotten off it. We decided to turn back around towards the exit, but it didn't bring us to the exit. It also didn't bring us to the path that looked wrong and started to break. It was a whole new part of the woods we'd never seen before. There was a door in the ground. It looked like a door to mine, maybe. We tried to do research, but there's no evidence of mine being there. But there are multiple mines in my city, so I wouldn't be surprised if it was just old and wasn't on record. Beside the door were about 5 or 6 white chairs, with what seemed to be white sheets laying on the ground around them. Like little pieces of white cloth. Not very big, just pieces. There were also beer bottles. The chairs were in a circle formation, but there was no fire pit in the middle or anything, just this circle of chairs. Looking back, it could have been a little campsite someone made, but man, was it scary at night when you were lost? It really freaked us out, and every time we walked away, it seemed we just made our way back to the chairs and the door. Obviously, we start trying to call and text people we know for help. I even called my parents, but no one answered. It was late, so I guess that makes sense. We are so lost and getting really scared that we are going to have to sleep up here. Eventually, after walking what seemed to be in circles, we just walked out. So fast, the exit was right there. We just walked on the path for a minute and we're out like that. Almost immediately after we leave, I get texts back from people I was trying to get help from. And one more creepy thing, just to put the icing on the cake, there were like 1032 pictures taken on my fiance's phone at 10:32 p.m. like a burst. If you have an iPhone, they have these things called bursts where you can take a lot of pictures quickly. It was so weird, the pictures were all just white. It's also weird how his phone took pictures while he had his flashlight on at the same time. The pictures were taken during the time we were lost. We didn't go back for about a year until me and my fiancé decided to go back and try and find the path we made it onto. Just for peace of mind. We couldn't find it, we couldn't find the door, we couldn't find anything weird. Except for a giant meat grinder? I hate the woods so much. It freaks me out to think about any wood or forest at any time. That's just one of the worst experiences for me, but I've had a few. Honestly, I just hope people don't think I'm bullshitting. It sounds crazy to me, so I can imagine someone thinking I'm lying, but I'm really just looking for a possible explanation. It's one of the things that bothers me to this day, and my fiancé doesn't like talking about it because there is just no explanation. Me and my best friend will still talk about it, but it goes nowhere because we have thought of every possible explanation we can think of. So any similar experiences or theories would be great. I've had many interesting things happen in the bush, but this one haunts me. I still hike in the dark, but this experience is always a thought while I'm out there. I distance hike when I can. Sometimes this means getting up early or staying out late to get as many miles in as possible. Sometimes, walking in the pitch dark with a low light headlamp gets spooky. I grew up in the woods in this area. I've slept under our canopy of stars more nights than I can count. I've trekked thousands of miles of trail, river bank, lake shore, ridge, bottoms, bogs, and creeks. I've hunted the game. I'm establishing this because it's important you understand I've heard, seen, and smelled all this region has to offer in the way of wilderness. My scariest experience, though, happened at about 0430 in the morning. It was late spring, so the first morning light wouldn't be visible in the treetops for another 30 to 45 minutes, another hour past that until sunrise. I was on mile 5. I'm on a low bottom that's wedged between 2 steep ridges. The trail I'm on is narrow, muddy, and completely hemmed in by thick underbrush, young maple, and old oak growth. I'm focused on the small light from my headlamp, just one step after the other, zoned out. Then I heard a loud crack. And I froze solid. This is the part I have trouble describing. 0430 in springtime means I'm the only thing making noise. No birds chirping, nothing. Dead quiet. Mid-step, I froze. When fight or flight kicks in, you have these immediate instinctive thoughts. The thought that instantly flashed in my mind as I stood there balancing myself into silence was, if I hear that again, I'm turning around, and I'm going back the way I came in a hurry. Why? Because that sound was not a branch breaking. It wasn't a deadfall. It wasn't a widowmaker. I was damn sure I had just heard something intentional. Hearing it twice, well, that meant get out of here. To describe it as best I can, it sounded like a decent-sized wooden stick being violently whacked against a smallish tree. More of a fungo bat-sized stick than a baseball bat. The distinction in my head was that this sound was a crack, not a thud or thump. And I have described it as explosive in the past because it was so sudden and so terribly loud. I had the sense that it was about 50 yards directly in front of me, and it was loud and clear. Now, as I stood there, completely spooked, I realized the soon-to-be worst part of my situation. I knew where the sound came from. And I knew where the trail went. In about 30 yards, I was going to come to a 180-degree turn and start up the ridge, going away from the creek. This meant that as soon as I got the courage to move towards this noise, I was going to have to turn my back on it and get up that ridge. This made me very nervous. My head is somewhere between meth fiend murder and Bigfoot bludgeoning. Minutes pass. I just breathe my foggy breath into my glasses and listen. Nothing. Dead quiet. I've got about 20 to 30 minutes until first light. I crank up the headlamp and start to slowly creep to the 180-degree turn. When you wear a headlamp in the woods at night, every tree branch in front of you casts a big black moving shadow on the trail. It didn't help. I get to the turn and quickly make the bend. I'm moving pretty fast at this point. Trying to be quiet. Taking tiny, shallow breaths so I can listen while humping it up the trail. And then this smell hits me that I can't describe. In my past life, I was a first responder. I've unfortunately worked on scenes where decomposition had set in before a deceased person was found. This was like decomposition, but, strangely, alive. It smelled wet and like soil. I imagined digging a garden and plunging into a recent pet burial. I kept walking fast. By the time I made the top of that ridge, I was huffing, and the first light was showing. I didn't stop moving until full light was out and the birds were chirping. I've heard it all in our woods. I've smelled it all. I'm telling you, I don't know what the hell that was. Deadfall, and especially leafed out branches, make a lot of noise on the way down. I've heard it many times. I don't know. Okay, so I've never really told anyone about this outside of my brothers, who were with me at the time when it happened. I am very much a skeptic of paranormal things, and yet some of the folks in my family are definitely believers. In fact, my own mother says that until I was about 2, we lived in a haunted house, which she has told me far too many stories about. I'm 35 now, and I must have been 8 or 9 when this happened, so we're talking around 1993. My dad and stepmom lived on the outskirts of Charlotte, North Carolina, in a town called Shuffletown that did not have many people living there. Me and my brother would go there on the weekends to visit, parents divorced, and we'd play with my stepbrother and generally have a fun time. We played in the woods a lot as kids back then, pretty much every day, and never saw anything strange. Anyway, that's the backstory. So one day we are playing in the backyard, probably cops and robbers or something similar to that. So the three of us are just running around the yard like kids do when I see something that literally makes me screech to a halt. I can still remember exactly where I was looking toward the woods. It was on the neighbor's side, back in the woods, probably 20 or 30 yards away from the grass line, with thick enough trees that it was hard to make stuff out. The sun was going down, and it was not quite twilight but on its way. The golden hour. From that vantage point, staring at me like nothing I'd ever seen before, were a huge pair of snake-like, glowing red eyes. I say glowing because I want to make it very clear that this wasn't an animal that the sunlight happened to be hitting in such a way to cause that effect. The eyes were way too big to be a deer or anything like that, and they were literally glowing in the deepest red I've ever seen before. I stood there staring at it, dumbfounded, while it was staring directly back at me, completely unwavering. It was the most terrifying feeling I think I've ever felt, just having this thing look at me. Finally, one of my brothers ran up to me and asked what I was staring at. I was kind of shaken out of my trance when he was talking to me, and I shook my head and looked at him, then went to point back at it while saying, "Don't you see that?" But stopped halfway through, as when I turned back, the eyes were gone. And that was it. I really don't know what to make of it. I don't know what I saw, but I know it was like nothing I'd ever seen before on this earth. I don't know if there is a lore or anything about what could be watching you from the woods of the Carolinas with huge, glowing red eyes, but I'd be very curious if any of you have any ideas as to what it may have been. As much as it pains me to say it, I've always had to assume that it was a demon staring at me. And again, I'm a skeptic. I've never wanted to tell anyone about this honestly because I don't want to get looked at like I'm nuts, but after listening to a bunch of stories here, I figured, why not share mine? So, what do you think? Let me preface by saying this happened around 10 years ago. Also, I've always been very skeptical of paranormal stuff, and I'm not at all superstitious, but one encounter will always stick with me. I grew up with my grandparents in a quiet suburb outside Washington, D.C., and our house was only a few hundred yards from a large park called Sleepy Hollow Woods. I used to always play in the woods as a child, alone or with friends, and never had any issues. I loved the outdoors and explored those woods thoroughly. However, I would never stay out after dark, of course. My mother grew up here as well and would always tell stories about the woods and believe they were haunted. She said plenty of creepy things happened to her. For instance, when she was younger, they had 2 family labs. They were super friendly, and my mother and uncles would walk them through the woods all the time. One time, my mother was walking alone with the dogs around dusk when she came across what she described as a ripped-off deer haunch lying covered in blood in the middle of a trail. There were no other deer parts, bodies, or blood anywhere to be seen, just this random, bloody leg. She described it as having the appearance of being ripped off, definitely not cut. Obviously freaked out, she took the dogs and just started heading home. All of a sudden, near the exit of the park, the dogs completely froze in their tracks and just started growling into the tree line. This was very unlike them, as they were super friendly with both people and other animals, were quite large, and never feared anything. However, as my mother kept trying to pull them along and see what they were growling out, their tails went between their legs, and they started whimpering, refusing to move forward. It was then that my mom said she saw a large, almost 8-foot dark figure with glowing red eyes move between the trees, staring right at her. She immediately turned around with the dogs and fled, taking a different exit out of the woods. My uncle has also said he's seen the red-eyed giant before, but never a clear view, always a silhouette. Keep in mind that there are no bears or anything of the sort around here that could or would do that to a deer. On another occasion, some years later, my mom recalled walking with our old golden retriever near the woods. Again, the retriever was the sweetest dog in the world and loved everybody. But my mom came across an old, creepy lady feeding and talking quietly to some wild rabbits on one of the sidewalks or trails. Immediately, our dog started growling at the woman, something my mother had never heard her do before. My mom immediately apologized to the lady and walked around her with her dog, tugging her along. As she continued to walk, she came across a circle of rabbits, all standing perfectly still and just staring at her. My mom promptly ran home. My mother and uncles have other stories, but I always thought they were full of shit, either just imagining things or making them up to scare me, since I've played in those woods so many times and never had any issues. However, my older brother used to go on nightly walks through the woods, and he told me he'd seen the red-eyed monster and other mysterious creepy encounters. I was around 15 or 16 at the time, and I loved ghost stories and had never encountered anything like that, so I was able to convince him to go ghost hunting with me. Of course, I thought it was all a bunch of silly bullshit anyway. The first time we went out, we had a few friends over. We were hanging out late at night, smoking weed, and telling ghost stories. Of course, we mentioned the haunted forest. We were living at a house down the street from our grandparents at the time, so we were still practically next door to the woods. My friends all thought it'd be fun if we went out into the forest to search for some ghosts and monsters and have a good laugh. We waited until it was about 2:30 a.m. and headed out. There was a fairly large group of us, maybe 6 to 8 people total, including my brother and myself. As we're walking through this pitch black forest using our phones as flashlights, I kid you not, all phones turned off at the same time. Of course, the girls in our group started freaking out, and to be honest, I'm pretty sure we all did, but we were also kind of laughing at the nonsense of it all. There was no noise anywhere other than us, the forest was completely dead silent, and after a few minutes, everyone was able to get their phones turned on and working again. We decided to head home at that point. It could have been a freak accident, I'm not really sure. The second time I went with my brother and a couple of other friends, this time with a much smaller crew, I think maybe 3 or 4 of us all together. As before, we'd thought it'd be fun and silly to go ghost hunting at night and see my brother's little Sasquatch friend. This time was different, however. The moment we entered the forest, things got weird. The forest felt unnaturally dark, and our lights barely reached the tree line on either side. We brought flashlights this time. We also immediately felt a large sense of dread, danger, and adrenaline, like we were being watched from all sides. Quite frankly, it was terrifying, as only moments before we were joking, laughing, and telling ghost stories, but we all immediately shut up and felt it not even 30 yards from the road or entrance to the forest. Whatever, we continued slowly walking deeper into the woods, talking and nervously laughing as we peered around with our flashlights. The forest was dead silent when suddenly, All at once, we heard what sounded like what can only be described as several thousand monkeys screeching at us from the treetops and tree lines in all directions, all around us. The noise was overwhelmingly loud and deafening. I've never heard anything like it before. It's hard to describe, but angry, hateful monkeys all crying out in anger at us is the best way to describe it. And those cries were definitely targeted at us. The sense of danger and dread immediately jumped to 11, and we wasted no time in turning tail and sprinting for the forest exit. The sounds of 1,000 lost souls screaming incredibly loudly chased us from above and around. Obviously, we saw no animals or anything in the trees or around us when flashing our lights up and about, but we were also more preoccupied with getting the duck out of there. Like I said, we were only perhaps a few hundred feet from the entrance of the forest, so it took no time at all to get out. The moment we stepped out of the forest and into the light of a nearby street lamp, the forest fell dead quiet. Not a rustle, not a whisper. For those of you wondering, there are not any ducking wild monkeys in these woods. Nor was there anything else I could think of that would make those sounds. But that SHT was loud. And obviously terrifying. We've never been back in those woods since, and I will never be caught in them past dusk if I ever go at all. I don't know if it was an angry hobo or something living out in the woods or what, but from memory, the best I can describe what I saw was a very large man figure walking or creeping quietly up on us, and once it saw that I had noticed it, it hunched down low and sprinted silently into the tree line straight for us. I have never felt such danger or hatred in my entire life. I know for a fact that whoever or whatever it was, it meant to do us great harm. I've since heard stories of crawlers and other such things, and perhaps this was an example of one, I don't know. But my brother swears on his life that he didn't set that up to scare us or have anything to do with what happened, and that he was just as terrified as I was at the time. Oh, and he never did find his throwing knife. Dumbass actually went back to look for it in the morning. Unfortunately, my brother never got to see it. He said he heard and sensed it following us, but he never got a view of the ducker. Anyway, I don't know what the deal is with that forest, but I highly recommend everyone stay far, far away from it at night. And yeah, for a skeptic, I can agree that it's unlikely that was a person. In fact, I'm certain it wasn't. I've always thought of it and referred to it simply as the creeper. And yes, it did have the glowing red eyes. What do you guys think it could have been? Have any of you had similar encounters? Let me know in the comments. My mom always told my sister and me this story when we were kids and still brings it up to this day, swearing that it really happened. My mom was born in 1966, and this story took place around age 4 or 5. So we're talking 70 or 71. Her grandparents lived in a trailer in the woods in rural Indiana, near a lake. My mother, her siblings, and cousins would spend summers there along with her aunts and uncles. There was no plumbing in the trailer, so they would all go in groups to use the public bathrooms, similar to a campground. One night, my mom was headed to the restrooms with a few of her cousins. She was on her teenage cousin's shoulders. When they got to the bathrooms, her cousin pushed the door open, and just inside the bathroom was a bear-like creature. On her cousin's shoulders, my mom was around 7 to 8 feet in the air, and she says the creature was standing face to face, eye level with her. That's how tall it was. It was standing upright like a man, obviously much taller than any man, and covered head to toe in dirty, matted brown fur. There was trash and tape stuck in the hair and fur. It didn't make a sound, it only turned and looked directly at them. My mom's cousin, along with everyone else in the group, booked it back down the hill and away from the restroom, obviously all terrified by what they had seen. To this day, my mom tells this story and recalls how horrified they all were. There was never any explanation, and I'm unsure if there were any similar sightings in the area around the time, but the story spooks me as much today as it did when I was a kid. Who knows what they saw out there, but I don't go camping or into the woods at night just to play it safe. Back in September of 2008, my best friend Sierra, pronounced Sierra, and I went to a park named Hocking Hills in the American state of Ohio for a day of retreat from our busy lives. We had decided on this at random when we first got together early in the morning, just after sunrise. It was a nice, warm late summer day, and we just got the wild notion to go for a drive to Hocking Hills since the area is well known for its several walking trails, a cave or two, several waterfalls, and running water and creek areas. The day was very warm, maybe roughly 70 degrees Fahrenheit or 21 degrees Celsius, so we had worn shorts and short-sleeved t-shirts. We started down a trail at random and found that part of the trail had been washed out, so we had to take another path, which, according to our phone's GPS tool, would force us to cross a small country road. As we played with our mobile phones and noted it was roughly 12 o'clock noon EST, we happened to be passed by a group of backpackers before we reached the road, and one of the people turned around to warn us to be aware of a washout up ahead if we were going to take the trail into the woods. They recommended we follow the one next to the fire tower instead, as it bypassed a small clump of down brush. As we crossed the road to the tower trail, we noticed there was caution tape all over the fire tower. There was a pungent smell in the air that we could not identify. The windows on top of the tower appeared to be taped up and grimy, and there were flies all over the area. We walked past it, commenting on how odd it was, and continued down the trail we had been recommended to take, but it was one neither of us had noticed before on a previous walk to the area. This trail took us past the fire tower and then cut into the woodlands. As we walked into the forest, maybe 1,500 feet, 457 meters, or so, we took notice that no one seemed to be around, and in fact, not only did we feel isolated from others, but we felt very chilled without explanation. Sierra pointed it out verbally while I was thinking about it, but we just continued walking. Eventually, the air started to get noticeably chillier and damper. This did not seem unusual at first, but as we continued to walk, the air seemed to go from warm to what felt like the mid-50s Fahrenheit or 10 Celsius, and we started to shiver. It was also getting darker as we continued forward. At first, I thought it was just due to the green leaves on the trees and maybe a passing cloud over the head, but the darkness really did not improve as one expected. As we walked, we looked around, and there were nothing but trees on all sides. There should have been a forest edge somewhere, as the area wasn't really that big, but aside from some hills and tall pine trees, there wasn't a real ending to the woods like we expected, as the area tends to be narrow and normally you can see the edges. My friend took out her phone to use her GPS because she instinctively felt lost, but her battery was nearly gone. I took mine out of my back pocket and it had no signal. The battery was also near dead, and it showed EE for the time, meaning it couldn't update as it was an older style flip phone with a camera and, when set to auto adjust, would contact the mobile phone network every 15 minutes. It was only then, as the light grew dimmer, that I noticed the area seemed very silent. Our footsteps, the leaves we stepped on, grass, twigs, and our breathing just echoed. Sierra got spooked, and I did too. She mentioned it was very out of the ordinary, and I agreed, but I couldn't shake this sense of foreboding that something was amiss. I tried to rationalize it, but I really, honestly, couldn't figure any of it out at all. We just pressed onwards, and after going down a small hill and back up, it seemed to have gotten a lot darker. The world seemed to have gone from just shadowy to near twilight darkness. My friend grabbed my arm and started freaking out about how weird it got. Then the air seemed to have gone still, and we had a feeling that something was wrong. We both took off running looking for an exit. For some odd reason, we never thought to turn around at all and just got back the way we came. It never seemed to occur to us as we ran, but the spookiness continued as we could hear our steps echo off the area as things just felt like they grew more gloomy. Then, ahead of us, down another small dip in the trail, we could see two large honeysuckle bushes on either side of the trail, like a gate. We made a mad dash for these bushes, and just as we pushed through the plants, something odd happened. We were overwhelmed by a change in our surroundings as light, sound, and warmth returned all at once. It was like stepping outside of a cold, empty, and dark building onto a warm, busy street. We stood at the edge of a place known as Ash Cave, which has a large waterfall not too far away with a U-shaped cliff. I turned around to look back from where we emerged, and while the bushes were the same, the area was so different, brighter, not silent for sure, and warm. In fact, our skin was too cold to touch, which just reinforced the facts. We took out our phones, and the time had finally updated. It was now 4 p.m. The normal trail would only have taken an hour to walk fully, so it was a loss of 3 full hours. Logic attempted to set in, and we decided the trail we came up with must have just appeared creepy because there may have been clouds over our heads or a storm blowing by, but when we went back between the bushes, there was no trail. Nothing looked like it did a few seconds ago. Sierra walked around the bushes twice, and it was the same bright, sunny day with no darkness and no trail. We waited, there was a blue sky over our heads, and we could see the edges of the forest and other people. The trail had simply vanished, as if we had never walked it. On returning to the normal trail with the washout, we ended up locating an offshoot path, which took us back past the fire tower. It was here that we noticed it was normal looking, as the windows were not taped and very clean, and there was no pungent smell. We don't know what it was, but it certainly was creepy. Of course, I jokingly told her later that day over dinner that we had entered the fairy realms by mistake and were lucky to get away. She didn't find that funny, of course, but either way, we both felt we should share this with you, and if anyone out there has had a similar experience, perhaps they can provide insight or share their own. I was a little shitbag back in school, and I would truant regularly. If I were on my own, I'd go to this wooded place, sort of triangled in by a main road on one end, another road lined with factories and warehouses, and the third side backed onto an estate with some bungalows, detached houses, etc., kind of a little green place in an otherwise built-up large town in the UK. In between these three boundaries, there were fields, which gave way to overgrowth, which then gave way to a group of around 30 to 40 trees, neither deep in the woods nor anything. Anyway, we had built a little den area in there to smoke weed and drink undetected by police, etc., and one day I wandered in there and fell asleep on this bent, gnarled tree that was almost parallel to the ground in sort of a hammock-type way, only to be woken by the sound of someone or something walking nearby in a way that would suggest they did not want to be heard. I leapt to my feet, and there was nobody and nothing there. No dog, cat, or deer that had maybe strayed too close to me without realizing dashed off startled, and I could see nobody or anything in the trees or the undergrowth beyond, but I could feel something was there watching me. My blood ran cold, and everything. Needless to say, I ducked off home sharpish and pretended there'd been a flood at school that day to explain my early return. I have no idea what or who that was, but I am convinced I came close to getting bummed off by some weirdo or eating off a rabid fox or something.